There's this quote that I really like from J.D. Salinger that is about book writing, but I think it applies equally to movie making. He said, "Writing a book is a horrible, exhausting struggle. One would never undertake such a thing if one were not driven by some demon." Book writers really relate to that. I imagine movie makers must relate to that too. So my question is, what's your demon? I could sort of see the demon in the movie, which really, really resonates, really comes across powerfully, is paternalism. This sort of, this condescension, this insulting, disrespectful attitude towards poor people, as opposed to sort of respecting them, respecting the dignity, the autonomy, the sovereignty of poor people to run their own lives, to make their own choices. So that really comes through in the movie. What was it, or when was it that sort of paternalism really came across to you and drove you to say, we really have to make a movie about this?
I'll start, let him take the good story in the middle, and then I'll finish. So first of all, it was hard. When I watch it sometimes, I'll think, oh my goodness, that was terrible. I hated that part. I mean, it just took so long to try to get it right. And so it was difficult. A couple things. So the underlying philosophical vision of the film you somewhat articulated, right? That we tend to treat poor people as objects of our charity, objects of our pity, objects of our compassion, instead of treating people as subjects. And I don't mean subjects to the king. I mean subjects like in grammar, like an I. And poor people are not objects. They are subjects, and they should be the protagonists of their own story of development. And we have combined a humanitarianism sentimentality with technocracy, where we think there's a technical solution to every problem, and social engineering, where we go in and we treat developing countries like labs for our experiments. And I think the driving force for me was to try to present or represent a person as a subject and not merely as an object. And I think, there's under a guise of humanitarianism, which becomes sentimental, we've done a lot of things that hurt poor people. We've done things, and that every time we do something that doesn't really work, we say, well, but our intentions are good. Well, okay, but how would we feel if in that case? And so I think this was kind of the driving force. And then, 20 years ago, I guess, when I was studying development, there's almost just standard, everybody was kind of a top-down social engineer. And I thought it was problematic, and you hadn't written your books yet. So there wasn't anything to read, except Peter Bauer. Peter Bauer, he, Angus Deaton talks about him in his new book, The Great Escape. I read Rhetoric and Reality and several other Bauer things, and was convinced by that. And but the driving force for me is really the subjective dimension of the person who has dignity, and is not an object. And I think, generally speaking, we treat people like objects instead of like subjects, and that was the driving force.
So what Michael just presented is what I heard him say when I heard him speak at a conference in 2009, and he really put his finger on something that I had been kind of experiencing but hadn't been able to put into words quite yet. And I invited him to coffee, and we talked for about 4 hours, and then spent the next 5-6 years together.
I invited you to a job.
He invited me to a job. But for me, it began. I think you framed it really well, because it is the underlying theme of the film. And my first eye-opening experience came when I was at the University of Notre Dame. And Notre Dame has a really interesting history. We actually have a sister college called Notre Dame College in Bangladesh. It's a French mission, and at the time, in the 1850s, when they sent missionaries to the New World, they also sent missionaries to the East. And the Notre Dame boxing team since 1931 has been supporting those efforts, mostly schools, and both in the city, like technical schools, but also a lot of village area schools. They've done a lot of work trying to protect the property rights of tribal peoples who have had violations against their land by the majority and the government. In 1931, the Notre Dame boxing team decided to support these efforts, and they raised $300 as a charity boxing tournament. And fast forward 78 years later, and I was a junior captain of the Notre Dame boxing team, and we were raising about $50,000 a year and sending over money to Bangladesh, and it was a really important cause for us. And we had this beautiful motto: it was strong bodies fight, fighting in the ring, that weak bodies may be nourished, fighting for something bigger than yourself. And this was on our billboards and our T-shirts and our promo videos and everything, and we were something we were very proud of. It was the first thing we would tell every novice boxer who would come in. And there were about 200 male boxers, about 100 women boxers. ESPN3 covers it every year, and it's a big deal. But until 2008, because of distance and wars, no students had ever actually been to Bangladesh. And so we decided, as the leaders of the team at the time, we were going to be the first. And so we went over there, and we brought a film crew. This was the beginning of the first film I produced. And I will never forget my first experience in a village school there. We came in, and these young women came out and did their cultural dances and presented us with flowers and sang their cultural songs, and I was in tears, as were my teammates. And we're all sitting up there, like five white guys, and our Bengali priest introduces us, and he says, "These are the Notre Dame boxers, and we have a great deal of gratitude for all the work they've been doing to support us for many years. And they have a beautiful motto. It's strong bodies fight, and they are the strong bodies, that weak bodies may be nourished, and we are the weak bodies." And all of a sudden, we just kind of sank in our seats. And I just thought about this, and I thought about it. And one of the girls verbally said, "Nah. Like, who are you calling weak?" They didn't get it. And so this taught me two things. One, exactly what Michael said. It's like we turn the poor into objects of our charity. We turn them into causes. And we lose sight of the person. But it also taught me that there's a profound disconnect between the West and the rest in terms of these ideas, because it's one thing for a bunch of 18 to 22-year-olds to make a mistake like that. It's another thing for no one to ever tap us on the shoulder and teach us. Tap us on the shoulder and say, "Hey, if you were looking at a person and saying that, it might come out a little different." Instead, everybody was constantly praising us for this. And so for me, that was really the beginning of my transformation. I think it's really important, as just one final note, is that you have these awakenings to this paternalism, but that doesn't mean that, okay, before I was on the right side of the fence, or the wrong side of the fence, now I'm on the right side of the fence. It has to be a continual process of reflection and introspection. And when we were shooting this film in Haiti, we went over with all the best intentions, and we were thinking, yeah, we're going to change the way people think about these people, and we're going to address paternalism. And then one day we were shooting in a tent city, and our co-producer got this beautiful picture of me with this adorable little kid. He's a tattered little T-shirt, and he's like touching my chin, and it's an amazing picture. And I put it up on Facebook, and then the next day I'm watching the likes skyrocket. And then I just sat back and I thought to myself, I don't even know that kid's name. I'm just cashing in on all the social capital I'm getting from being an independent filmmaker in Haiti. Yeah, and Michael has a great thing he wrote. He said, "The poor stay poor while the rich get hipper." And it's true, and that's why I say, like Shelley Clay in the film, when she says, "My only concern about doing this interview is that I don't want to be like pointing the finger," right? And there has to be an invitation to have this continual process of introspection and reflection to make sure that we're constantly seeing persons and not causes.
You can tell that I was a philosophy professor and he's a boxer, because I'm like, the theoretical reasons for my, see, but philosophers get inspired by philosophy. So the other, just one quick thing that in addition to that, was an impetus, like one of the things we wanted to make, is you hear people say all the time, if we were just more generous, we could end extreme poverty forever. And like Bono says, that's what's fallen to us to do. And there's there's a well-known Christian leader who says, if North American Christians were more generous, we could raise $84 billion and we could end extreme poverty forever. Right? And this is the kind of one campaign thing. And the answer is, no, we couldn't. Because poor people are not poor because they lack stuff. I mean, it is complex. Poverty is deeply complex, and you're spending all these time thinking about it, and there's no simple solution, and good people can disagree. But generally speaking, poor people in the developing world are not poor because they lack stuff. They're poor because they are excluded from the institutions of justice. Things like clear title to their land, ability to register a business, access to justice in the courts, and the ability to have free exchange. And these are the things that we take for granted. And so we're spending all of this time and we're ignoring these fundamental institutions of justice. And that's the other thing we wanted to get across, that the dignity and the subjective dimension of the person, and that poor people are not so much dominated by markets as that they are excluded from them because they lack the institutions of justice that are just the air that we breathe.
Well, just to continue on that theme, there's this powerful sentence at the beginning of the film that then gets echoed kind of more subtly throughout the film, that who has the power and who should have it? And that was such a powerful statement, because I'm sure you're frequently accused of just being cynical guys, just looking cynically at the people working in the aid system. And yet that question is kind of at the heart of what you're saying, right? That it's this situation is arising because the intended beneficiaries of this system really have no power. Could you kind of say some more about that sentence and how you think about that?
So, I mean, part of this comes back to if you remember the section, it was called the social fact, where we use kind of a Durkheimian analogy. That, and part of the thing with cynicism, I think one thing we tried to do, and I spoke at USAID just a couple weeks ago, and I've talked to someone from USAID had seen the film, and I said, did you feel that we were just, disrespecting? And they said, no, actually, I felt that our goal was not to make a demon out of anybody. And so, for example, I'm just a quick aside here. So in the film, like sometimes when we were making it, people were like, hey, I heard this great story about, such and such an orphanage was, instead of caring for orphans, they started trafficking the children, right? And we can, that's a great, that's going to show how the problems. And I always said, no, that's a corruption of a good thing where they take it and they do something bad with it. Or, foreign aid, the money was stolen and done here. And we wanted to actually show how really good intended, benevolent people who are not corrupt are still doing things that are harmful. And this is that line that one person says, they're making a harmful system more efficiently harmful. And so the part of the idea of the power is going back to, I think, two questions. The first one is that subjective dimension of the person, that the person should be the protagonist. And I know this is boring to say the same thing, but it is true that the people are locked out from the institutions of justice. And that's where Herman Chinner Hesse, the Ghanaian entrepreneur, says, people are not stupid. They're just disconnected from global trade, right? And that this is kind of the one question. Poverty is deeply complex. But the first question we're always asking is, why is there poverty? But the better question is, how do people create prosperity in their own families and their own communities, right? So this is all the problem. Like, what can I do to help, right? And so all of us who are concerned about these things, we see a problem, and maybe the first time we see the problem, it's this emergency. You've never seen abject poverty. And I'll say to people, it's an emergency for you and for me. It's a chronic situation for most people. So the question is not, oh my goodness, what can I do to help? The question is, what do people need to be able to create prosperity in their own families and their own communities? And when this question gets asked, it shifts the focus from us, either as the do-gooder or the social engineer or the hero to end poverty, and puts the focus where it belongs. And this is part of the power question. But it also, our hope is, that it asks, okay, well, what are those things? Well, what does enable people's prosperity? Well, clear title to land, right? 60 to 70% of some places, there's no clear title. So, and if you remember this, well, I don't think it's in the film. But no, yeah, it is. Herman Chinner has it. There's a long interview with him. He's like, you've been here for 40 years and you just forgot we don't have private property rights? Right? And I think that's the part of the power question.
A few years ago, we got a grant, I don't remember from who, to host a film festival of our own. And we did it here in New York City, actually, in 2013. And this was a great way for us to invite ideas around these issues. And the theme we chose was human flourishing from all over the world. And I watched 254 films as one of the judges, and I learned so much. And even the bad films teach you something, especially documentaries where you're just spending time with people. We gave a $10,000 grand prize to a really amazing film called Eviction. And some really courageous filmmakers went into Cambodia during a very heated time there. And what happened was the communist government of Cambodia had sold huge blocks of land out from under people's feet to a multinational company. And then the company came in with legal standing backed by the government and police officers and bulldozers and just bulldozed people's homes for a pittance of money for a development project. And the people had no say. There was no vote. There was the money was not enough that people could actually doing anything with it. And I think, it's a very interesting case study because people who are traditionally suspicious of the consolidation of corporate power look at this story and say, this is the problem with global capital markets and foreign direct investment. And people who are traditionally suspicious of the centralization of government power look at this and say, this is the problem with communism and the centralization of power. And the fact is they're both right. The centralization, the hyper-centralization of a government like that actually creates a super magnet for the most powerful corporations to come in, curry favor, block people out, and raise the barriers of entry to the marketplace so that other people can't compete. And so that little space is kind of where this film is hanging out, right? And those power dynamics of those two feeding off of each other. And I think that's one of the reasons that this film has been totally traversing the political spectrum, from winning libertarian awards at major film festivals and the Templeton Foundation to being endorsed by Michael Moore and Variety and the film festival circuit. And I think that's, especially in this hyper-politicized, polarized climate of the primaries and everything else going on, it's exciting that there are still places where we can come to the table and actually talk about some fundamentals. And like Michael said, those fundamentals are things we take for granted. Whatever your political persuasion in the US, everybody here can get title to their car or title to their house or have a bank account. Or, even if you're not a business person, I'll bet you have a formal legal contract with your employer, whoever that is. So if you work for a university or a nonprofit, you're still in the formal economy. You're exchanging your labor for compensation, and you're protected within a system of justice. And those are the fundamentals that when we travel to these different countries, those are the fundamentals that are lacking, and it's refreshing that people from all sides of that political spectrum are willing to come together and actually talk about those things.
Can I say one quick thing? This did remind me, like the crony capitalism part. I mean, sometimes I'll talk at different places and we speak to tons of different groups, and one of the things I talk about is the importance of free exchange. And this can shock people, right? I mean, I speak in religious places or, different universities, whatever. And I remember, like, I was talking about free exchange. Like, free exchange, well, doesn't that hurt the poor? I was like, it can, right? But this kind of the point that Mark made. I mean, one of the reasons why free exchange is so important is because when a government highly regulates an economy, who do you think writes the regulations? Massive corporations, powerful interest groups like trade unions, and the poorest of the poor lack the political, social, and economic contacts to navigate a system that's dominated by bureaucracy. And this is kind of the one point that happens. Like, Hernando de Soto took 289 days to register the business. I mean, like, they don't have clear title to their land or security from bad guys. I'm not saying there's no place for the state. I'm saying there's no security from bad guys. You can't get some basic services. The Center for Research in India did a study. It takes an average of 20 years to get your court case heard. And it's expensive. If you're a widow, orphan, poor, excluded, it's going to take even longer. Yet at the same time, there's this incredible, massive regulations that prevent anybody from doing anything. I mean, I think this is the problem, that it's not simply like the state or the market, but you have this connection into deep crony capitalism that just excludes poor people. And Hernando Soto says it fantastically when he says, the legal systems are simply unfriendly to poor people.
There's a joke that goes, the problem today is that evil corporations are running the government. What's the solution? The government.